Hello, everybody. Jacob Jans here with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. I'm excited for today's talk. If you're here, welcome. We're just going to wait a minute or two so that everybody who will be showing up live has a chance to show up before we get started. So we're just going to have a couple-minute buffer so everyone can show up and say hello. Oh, wonderful. Hi, Sherry. Good to see you in the Irish Riviera. I'm so glad you're here. Hello, Elaine. Good to see you. See your name. Hello, Beatrice. Hello, Beverly. Hello, Julie. Wow, so many people I know here today. That's wonderful. Hello. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Hi, Gwen and Krista. Hello in Boston and Birmingham. Hello in South Jersey and Nashville. Hello in London. Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you. So we're just going to wait one more minute so that everybody can show up before we get started. Really excited for today's talk. I hope you are as well. Emily Harstone has done a number of really wonderful talks for us today. I mean, over the years, and I'm really excited for the one from today. Hello in Buffalo and Bronx, and hello in DC and New York. We're in Toronto right now. It is a day that feels a little bit like summer, although we've started to get some fall weather coming in too. So hello in Scotland and South Africa. Hello. Hello, everybody. Oh, Yellow Springs, Ohio. I have actually been to a writing retreat there many years ago. Hello. Hello in Lithuania. Okay, so today's going to be a lot of fun, I think, and hopefully it will be really meaningful and valuable to everybody. So let me pull up my notes and let's get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Emily Harstone, who will be giving a talk on the power of titles and giving you strategies for choosing the right titles for your prose and poetry. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we host talks on the business of publishing and the craft of writing. Emily Harstone is a founding editor of Authors Publish magazine and the author of many popular books for writers, including Submit, Publish, Repeat, How to Publish Your Creative Writing and Literary Journals, and the Authors Publish Guide to Manuscript Submissions. Emily is also an instructor for the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish, where she's helped many writers polish their writing and find publication, both in literary journals and with traditional presses. Thank you, Emily, for being here today and for sharing your knowledge. I'm excited for today's presentation. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a good day. Yeah, so go ahead and pull up your slideshow, and everybody should know we will be sharing the slides after the talk when we send out the recording, and they include links to resources that you'll be able to refer to on your own time. So do know you're going to be getting the slides as well as the recording later on.
Yes, definitely keep that in mind. And there's definitely some things that you'll probably want to come back and spend more time with in that is linked to here. So I'm going to start now. This is called The Power of Titles, Strategies for Choosing the Right Title for Your Stories and Poems. Titles are more often than not the first impression a potential reader has of your work, but they're often underutilized. The most common type of title is what I think of as the clear title or the placeholder. Throughout this lecture, I'll mostly refer to it as the placeholder title. This is a title that conveys the core idea or themes of the piece when it comes to nonfiction. When it comes to fiction or poetry, it tends to just cover one aspect of the book. For example, The Woods or Evening. And all of the titles I use in this lecture are like traditionally published books or poems. So I'm not just pulling these names out of a hat. I often think of a placeholder title as the most obvious choice, one of the first 2 or 3 titles anyone would think while trying to title the work. I think if you handed that book to someone and they read it and they came up with the title all on their own, or one of the titles you were considering all on their own, that's it. You've chosen a placeholder title. Just because the placeholder title is the obvious choice, that doesn't make it the wrong one. It is especially common for work on the bestseller list to have a placeholder title. The title of this lecture very much falls into the placeholder category. I could have been a lot more creative with it, but it wouldn't have necessarily helped getting the audience to the lecture that I actually wanted. This type of title very much serves a purpose. I'm not knocking it. Often it's the right choice. This type of title clearly and efficiently communicates what the book or poem or movie or song is about, especially in the context of the genre it belongs in. When you see a book called Breathe, The New Science of the Lost Art, you have a pretty good idea right from the title what it's about and if you're interested in reading more, which is really helpful. And with nonfiction, we have the subtitles doing a lot of work too. The New Science of a Lost Art. It's part of the title, even though it's a little separate. One of the downsides of the placeholder title is it's often generic, and it actually doesn't tell the reader about the specifics of your book. For example, the title Crossroads could fit a lot of books and is a common title in many different genres, but it's hard to remember and connect with it in terms of specifics. Besides, there's already been more than one best-selling book with this title already. Titles can't be copyrighted, so they can be used by multiple authors. They can be trademarked, but it's really, really rare and very much the exception to the rule. And I think this can be a really real problem if you're used to like recommending books to others. I read this wonderful book many years ago called The Wanderers by Meg Howry, and I really loved it and recommended it to so many people. And maybe I didn't go into the specifics enough, but there are two other books with almost exactly that title that are bestsellers too. One's by Chuck Wendig. I can't remember who the other one's by right now. And two of the many people I recommended it to ended up reading these other books, which were very different. And that's one of the ways it can be confusing or a possible problem. There are titles that are placeholders that are still really specific and distinct. For example, The Hunger Games belongs to the placeholder title category, but is still specific and intriguing. And the reason why I say The Hunger Games belongs in that category is if I gave you that book without a title and you read it, you would probably come up with the title The Hunger Games. Maybe Katniss Everdeen, but probably The Hunger Games. Genre can play a role in making what seems like a placeholder title work. So You Sexy Thing is the title of many romance novels and is also one science fiction novel by Kat Rambeau, who we've had on these talks before. When you search for that title on Goodreads, the science fiction novel is clearly the most successful book with that title. In part, I think, because it subverts expectations and surprises people. The cover is also really satisfying because it says "You Sexy Thing" and then has a really like traditional science fiction cover of like a spaceship, and it's the cover is very genre appropriate and the title is a surprise. This lecture isn't going to cover how to come up with a placeholder title for your book, poem, song, movie. You can figure that out without me. You don't need me. You don't need this lecture. You can go do that on your own. This lecture is going to focus on titles that don't fit in the placeholder category. This lecture is going to be broken into two parts: the title's role in prose and the title's role in poetry. So if you're a poet and you're like, oh, I just want to listen to the poetry part, or you're a prose author and you're like, oh, what's the point of this poetry section? Information in both is helpful to prose and poetry writers. It's just a little more focused into these sections. The information is still like largely relevant, especially if you write short stories. A lot of the information in the poetry section is going to be relevant to you. And I also am going to stick around and answer questions after. So the title's role in prose. Title and genre, for the most part, are intrinsically linked. And I touched on this a little before with the "You Sexy Thing" mention. But there are some genres like romance and nonfiction where going with a non-placeholder title is the exception to the norm and confusing. So in the introduction of the 25th anniversary edition of the nonfiction book, The Spell of the Sensuous, the author spends like a lot of time explaining how much trouble the title has caused him over the years. Not that he regrets it. He's still really glad he went with it. I think that's what I remember anyways. But it's been like shelved in the erotica section and like was banned for no good reason. And it's a book on shamanism, actually. And a lot of, and you can see how those two things might be linked, but it's hard for most people to get there. You can probably correctly guess the genres of most of these books without knowing anything more but the title. And so this is actually the hardest part of the lecture for me because I'm going to shut up for a minute after this, actually just 30 seconds. That is long. That is as long as I can be quiet on camera when not listening to someone else, obviously. So I'm going to name all of these. I'm going to say all of these titles and give you 30 seconds to think about it. And then I'm going to reveal which genre they belong to. So the Kaiju Preservation Society, The Book of Form and Emptiness, I Kissed Shara Wheeler, Witch King, Love Real Food, The Man Who Died Twice, The Martian, Shiny Misfits. So think about which genres go with these titles. I think that was about 30 seconds. The answers. So the Kaiju Preservation Society is science fiction. The Book of Form and Emptiness is literary fiction. I Kiss Shara Wheeler is young adult and romance. Either of those answers would be totally valid. Witch King is fantasy. Love Real Food is a cookbook. The Man Who Died Twice is a mystery. The Martian is science fiction. And Shiny Misfits is middle grade fiction, which if you're not as familiar with Kids Lit might be a little hard for you to guess, but I have children, so very familiar with it. Not all titles have this clear connection to the genre they are part of, but many do, even if they aren't placeholders. It can be helpful to spend time thinking about other titles in your genre and how your prospective title works or doesn't within the larger context of that genre. Titles of book-length fiction generally have to do one or more of the following things: convey a unique aspect of your book, The Hunger Games, A Magic Steeped in Tea, and like A Magic Steeped in Tea is about tea magic. So you get that from the title, even though it sounds nicer than that. Convey the genre. That's another thing that they often do, like The Quantum Magician and The Rosie Project. And communicate an idea you want the readers thinking about. So the best of it, like the best of what? Or Free Piano, Not Haunted. I really like that title because you know after reading it that that piano is definitely haunted. And of course, it is indeed haunted. A lot of titles I'm drawn to are ones that are intriguing, including The Left Hand of Darkness, Parable of the Sower, and East of Eden. Sometimes even one-word titles can be made intriguing, like Martyr. The exclamation point is actually part of the title, and that's part of why it is intriguing, because why is there an exclamation point after Martyr? Want to read the book now, right? It's a good book, I think. I like that these titles have a question attached to them, like what could the parable of the sower be? Titles aren't immune to trends, especially in mainstream publishing. The trends that really stand out to me in terms of titles is this, and I've actually brought quite a few of these because of how intriguing the titles are, but I'm a little wary of number use now, and it's to include a number in the title itself. Examples include The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, The Five People You Meet in Heaven. Full names are often in mainstream titles as well, like The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And I would say that there's nothing wrong with having this approach to a title. Just know that you're part of this larger school of books that does that. And also maybe avoid using the name Evelyn. With prose and poetry, one of the most important things to think about when coming up with a title is how it connects with the book itself. This is trickier to do with non-placeholder titles because they aren't the first option that comes to mind. But it's still important to help because it helps the reader remember the title even after they've finished the story, and that makes them more likely to recommend it to others. So I've noticed that if I read a book on my Kobo or any sort of electronic device, it's much harder for me to remember the name of it. And this is a common problem. I've seen it crop up for other people too. And that makes me less likely to recommend the book if I don't remember the title. So you want it to be distinct enough to really stick in someone's memory, even if they're not seeing it all the time in physical form. Like all of the titles that I include in this lecture are titles of books that I own and are around the house physically, almost always, because those are what stick in the mind. Questions I ask myself when I'm coming up with titles for a book-length work of prose. 1, what makes my book unique? 2, what language in the title would help prepare the readers for the story I tell? 3, what title would look good on the cover? Which is not too long, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. 4, what would help make the genre clear or establish the tone of the novel? Of course, with book-length prose, especially of the mainstream variety, the author will not always have the final say in what the title will be. Like the cover and the blurb and the back cover text, final approval of the title does not always go to the author. There's a good article on this here, and afterwards you can definitely read it. I really encourage it. It's in the Paris Review. It includes great examples of books where the publisher chose the title. For example, George Orwell wanted to call 1984 The Last Man in Europe, which really changes the way you interact with it, for me at least. And Toni Morrison preferred the title The Wrath of Children over God Help the Child, which is a very different impression again. Still, most of the time, the titles authors use for querying is the same title that ends up being on the cover of the book. Even if it is eventually changed by the publisher, the title you query with is still very important, and it helps make the first impression on agents and editors. For short stories, a lot of the advice given in the poetry section is also relevant, more than the advice shared in this section. That's because many short stories are published in literary journals first, just like poems are, before being published as part of a larger collection. Submitting work to literary journals is a very different and separate process than submitting manuscripts, and I'm not going to get into either of those here. I have done lectures on both of them, though, in our archives if you want to check them out. The title's role in poetry. My hopefully slight bias against placeholder titles comes from teaching poetry. Not that the wrong title can't really hurt a book or a short story. It can, and I have seen that happen. But in prose, you have a lot more words to win the reader over with. Most poems are between 50 and 300 words, which means every word counts, and that includes the title. Yet many poets choose to give their poems a title that is then repeated in the poem itself, which isn't always a bad thing. I'm going to go into more details about that soon. Or they choose a really broad, overused word in poetry to be the title, like love or hope. And it's possible to write a good poem with hope or love in the title, but it's very difficult. And most of the poems with that title are probably not very good. And also, it's really hard for someone to find that poem because there's so many other poems out there with that general broad title. As a poet, I haven't always put as much emphasis on titles. But working as a reader and then an editor for a literary journal really changed that for me. And this is almost 2 decades ago now. When I was in that role, I had to read about 1,000 poems over the period of 2 months. And that's like a very standard experience. I had to pick around 10 poems out of all those poems to share with the other readers and the other editor the second year. But after reading so many, all the poems started to merge together in my mind. It didn't help that a number of them had the same title. I would say there was like 5 or 6 poems with the exact same sort of rare Yiddish phrase in the title that both years, actually. Sometimes I'll try and remember a poem I liked, but then ended up not finding it because I remembered part of the poem. I didn't remember the title. Oftentimes, the poets I talk to don't think of the title as very important. The title just isn't a priority or something they really think about. So why shouldn't it be a placeholder? I would say over 70% of the poems I read have placeholder titles. Yet, a memorable title really helps set a poem apart for readers as well as editors. Just to be clear, there is the right time and place for a placeholder title in a poem, in poetry, as well as fiction, but I would say the majority of poems benefit from having a non-placeholder title, which isn't something I necessarily say about fiction, and definitely something I wouldn't say about nonfiction. Now, before I go any further, oh, shoot, sorry. Now, before I go any further, I have to give credit to the poet Matea Harvey, who also helped me think a lot more clearly about titling. She gave a great lecture while I was in graduate school, actually physically in the school, called If You Agree, Won't You Change the Title for Me? You can read her essay that covers some of the same information here with a free account from JSTOR, but unfortunately, the lecture, which she gave many times, and another version of it was available online for a long time, is no longer available online anywhere I could find it. But that essay gets to a lot of the main points she makes. What I call placeholder titles, Harvey calls license plate titles. She also has a separate category and distinct phrases for describing poems that contain the words or phrases from the title in the poem itself. She calls these spotlight titles. I love a lot of poems with spotlight titles, including From the Desire Field by Natalie Diaz, and What I Mean When I'm Sharpening My Oyster Knife by Eve Ewing, and The More Loving One by W.H. Auden. If the phrase that is repeated is strong and distinct or intriguing, it can really bear and even benefit from the weight of a lot of attention being on it. It can help strengthen a poem as a whole and make it feel more cohesive. For me, there are two potential traps that exist with the spotlight title strategy. The first is that a poet can overuse this strategy. If the majority of one's poems rely on this strategy to work, the poems become too predictable. The second is that the phrase that is used in the title and later in the poem isn't powerful enough to hold up to the stress of being so emphasized, and it ends up feeling dull or redundant. I have also noticed that some poets over-rely on ending on the title phrase, so the first and last thing you read are the same words. This can work occasionally, but if you do it too often, it becomes predictable and a little frustrating for readers. I once read a submission packet where every single poem used this strategy when I was an editor for a journal. Another common strategy when titling a poem is to actually have the title act as the first line of the poem. I Ask That I Do Not Die by Ilya Kaminsky is a good example of a poem that relies on this strategy. It can be a helpful strategy, but isn't effective if it's overused. Some titles add another layer to the poem once you've read the entirety of the poem. Harvey calls this titling strategy helium because it's like adding helium to a balloon to make it something more than it otherwise would be. So I often strive for helium titles, but it isn't possible to always use them. And I think it could wear out too, that strategy, but it's a little trickier too. The example Harvey uses of this type of title is Thinking of a Relation to the Images of a Metaphor by Wallace Stevens. I think Real Estate by Richard Seikin is a good example of this strategy, and I'm actually going to share it with you so we can really think and talk about it. Or I'll talk about it in depth, and maybe it'll come up again in the Q&A. Jacob, is it showing up? I can't see it.
Yeah, it should be visible now.
Can other people see it? Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad other people can see it. I cannot, so I'm gonna pull it up here. Real Estate by Richard Sagan. My mother married a man who divorced her for money. Phyllis, he would say, if you don't stop buying jewelry, I will have to divorce you to keep us out of the poorhouse. When he said this, she would stub out a cigarette, mutter something under her breath. Eventually, he was forced to divorce her. Then he died. Then she did. The man was not my father. My father was buried down the road in a box his other son selected, the ashes of his third wife in a brass urn that he will hold in the crook of his arm forever. At the reception, after his funeral, I got mean on 4 cups of lime sherbet punch. When the man who was not my father divorced my mother, I stopped being related to him. These things are complicated, said the Talmud. When he died, I couldn't prove it. I couldn't get a death certificate. These things are complicated, says the health department. Their names remain on the deed of the house. It isn't haunted, it's owned by ghosts. When I die, I will come in fast and low. I will stick the landing. There will be no confusion. The dead will make room for me. And so I chose this poem to share. And it's a prose poem. So if everyone's panicking about the lack of line breaks, that's deliberate. I chose this poem to show, and I'm not going to read a bunch of other poems. This is the one I've chosen to show because I feel like the title is very plain and ordinary and easy to ignore, but it adds so much helium to the poem. Because you go into it thinking it's about one thing and the sort of real estate we talk about in our day-to-day lives. And then you learn it's about this other kind of real estate and you sort of shifts your perspective. And the author wrote it after a stroke where their relationship to language changed entirely. So I think that's an interesting element too to it. And we'll link to it at the end, but it's called Real Estate. I'm going to start my screen share right now. And there is going to be a moment where you see like the wrong thing, uh, which is to say I have to bring it up fully. Okay. Okay, so hopefully it's working now again. Some titles add another layer. So now we're on to the next slide. Sorry about that. You might notice that I'm not giving any examples in this section without linking to the work. This is because, in my opinion, and you can see from the poem I just read, you can only really understand the greatness of most poem titles after reading the poem. One of my favorite poems, Theology by Ocean Bung, might seem like it has a placeholder title, but reading it reveals that it is in fact a helium title. Most of the time, you have to read the poem and the title together to understand the strength of their relationship and the nuance to it. So a few more poems to read after the lecture to understand how the title and poem relationship can work. I'm going to warn you that the first one, Dorothy Wordsworth, contains swearing. None of the others do, though. So if you want to skip it, that's fine. It is a good poem. The Conditional by Ada Limon is one of my all-time favorite poems. And The Coniferous Fathers by Michael Kleber Diggs, he read that during one of his talks for us. And it's incredible. I played it for my father and he cried. When I title a poem, I don't think of the category its title might belong until after the revision process. So this isn't something I go in thinking, oh, this is going to be a helium title I'm coming up with. I have a lot of different strategies for titling poems in general, and some of them I'm sharing now. And some of them you could definitely apply to short stories or even a novel, although maybe not this first one. So this is a strategy I use a lot, and it's titling the poem first. For my students, I often give the title as a prompt, not always, but just every so often, and they have to write the rest of the poem from it. And the way I think of this is that I'm handing someone like a hat or a scarf, and they have to build the rest of their outfit around this hat or scarf. And so they already know sort of where they're going. They're not going to like put on a scarf and then don a swimsuit, although I guess it could work with the right kind of scarf. But what I'm saying is that the title can change and sort of shape the direction of the poem, but it doesn't determine it. And one of the things I really like about giving this prompt is then reading the results of it and seeing like where people take it, which is very different directions. Even though all of these poems have the same title from this prompt, they end up being very fundamentally different poems. So I actually do this for myself often. And one of my most common strategies is to pick a prose book off the shelf and decide that I'm going to write a poem about it, like The Three-Body Problem or Shadow Country. When I do this, I either haven't read the book at all or I read it a long time ago, but no matter what, I don't cover the same content that's in the book, even if I have read it. And that's because I'm writing something new. When I'm stuck sometimes, I'll write down a dozen possible titles, and then later, sometimes a long time later, I'll use those titles. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. Writing titles with a timer. So sometimes if I've written a poem, I can't figure out the title to, I'll set a timer and force myself to write down as many potential titles to that poem I can before the timer runs out. The timer forces me to write down really awful, embarrassing, and hilarious titles too. Like I'm not going to say they're all gems. They definitely aren't. But by writing those down, I can get to new ideas and often better titles. So I usually end up ending up with a workable title through this strategy. Stealing from my own poems. I use the term stealing loosely because I'm the author and I give myself permission. But I will reread old poems that I've written that either didn't work as a whole or were just too personal for me to publish. And I will then use a line I liked in a new poem. And often that will be as the title, but not always. Sometimes it will be in the middle of the poem. Asking a friend. So sometimes I'll exchange poems with friends and we'll come up with the titles or potential titles for each other. It's helpful to have a perspective beyond your own when titling, and you can learn some interesting things about your own writing and theirs by doing this, in my experience. As far as titling a poetry collection, most authors seem to have the same strategy, or publishers, depending. The collection as a whole and a singular poem in it often share the same name. This titular poem, I'm not used to pronouncing this word out loud. I'm sorry for any words I've mispronounced in this lecture. I'm sure there are others. So this titular poem is the one most closely linked to the themes of the broader book generally. There are other approaches too, like focusing on distilling the primary themes of the collection in the title. If it's a collected or selected work of an author, it usually is just simply called that, like the collected works of W.H. Auden. In conclusion, so I actually read this while I was putting together this lecture. The author Naomi Novik, who I really like, published a collection of short stories. And before each short story, she shares a little bit of context about it in the foreword. And so this is the context for one of the stories in that collection. It was inconsiderate of me to write a story called 7 Years from Home, and also a story called Seven. I apologize. I can't even claim that it was an accident. This was the second story of the two, and I recognized what I was doing at the time, but there wasn't any help for it. Sometimes you know a title from the beginning, and sometimes you never know it and have to resentfully slap something on at the end. And in this case, I knew from the very first line. I'm sharing this because I think it's a good quote and also gets to two truths in my experience. Sometimes the title just presents itself and nothing else will work with a text in your mind. You'll just know what it is and you will not be able to change it, even if others try and talk you out of it. And that's okay. Sometimes you just need to pick a title and stick with it, even if you don't like it, because having no title at all is not an option. And whenever I say that, because I've said it before in other classes. Everyone brings up Emily Dickinson, but that was a very long time ago. Her plan was not to traditionally publish them. And we've ended up basically slapping on titles and using the numbers and using the first line as titles anyways. So it's just not a good approach, personally, I think. There's exceptions, but they're hard to find. Hopefully, this lecture has given you a new perspective on titles or shifted it a little, and hopefully you have some questions that I'll be happy to answer in a few minutes. But before that, I want to share a few additional resources for further reading. And the good news is that you'll be able to spend more time with them afterwards because of the links. But the title of the poem is actually a book. It's a book that really inspired Matea Harvey when she was putting together her lecture. Making It Work is 5 jobs for poems titles, and it's just an article, but it's really helpful. And so are the remaining. They're all articles outside of the title of the poem. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and thanks everyone for listening. I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was wonderful and very thought-provoking. And titles are one of those things where, on the face of it, they're so simple, but there seems to be so many different ways to consider a title and the different perspectives one can take in terms of choosing a title, right? So we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. If you have a question, feel free to post it there. We'll get to as many as we have time for. And I will take a look at what we have. So oh yeah, an anonymous attendee said, "I appreciate that you included something for Kidlit. I would appreciate if picture books could also be included in these presentations." And I actually thought of a number of my favorite titles of picture books. I don't know if there are some you can come up with, but to our kids, I just read The Bureau of Misplaced Dads, which that's an evocative title, right? Like The Word Collector or A to Twist Scientist. That's a really popular book, and it like all of these seem to like include strategies that you talked about.
Definitely. And there's lots of different strategies and like almost subgenres in Kidlit. Like my youngest really loves goofy books. And so I knew right away when I saw a title called The First Cat in Space Ate Pizza, I was like, oh, I know to read this now. So that's one of the ways it can be really helpful. And there's lots of good picture books for kids that have excellent titles. Um, I'm trying to remember this one. Like one of them is Baby Monkey Private Eye, because that communicates a whole story right there. So thank you for bringing that up.
We have a question from Kathleen. What do you think about a nonfiction title with an ambiguous title followed by a clear subtitle? For example, Thunderbolt, The Reality of Head Trauma.
I've seen that actually in bookstores quite often. So, that strategy, not that exact title, not to make you panic or anything. And I think it's a good strategy. Because you have the one word to get the reader's attention, and then you have the subtitle to ground it in context, which can be very helpful. I think it's a good strategy. I think for quarrying, it would definitely be the right approach. I wouldn't necessarily look further than that.
I think we had another question about the pros and cons of subtitles, and I can say that subtitles are extremely common in nonfiction, but do they ever happen in fiction?
They are really uncommon. I see them a lot when people are working on manuscripts, but in the bookstore, you almost never see them. I did notice that one of the bestsellers this summer had a subtitle, and it was Atmosphere, a Love Story by Taylor Jenkins Reid.
Yeah.
But I would say it's very much like the exception rather than the
Oh,
rule.
that's interesting. The subtitle was placing the genre.
Yes,
It was a call out to the readers because the title was ambiguous as to who it was for.
definitely.
Yeah. And that one of the insights I had when you had the at the beginning, all of the titles, and you had us all guess the genre, is the people that you want to guess the genre are the ones who you want to read. If they're not your readers, it doesn't really matter if they know the genre from the title, right?
Definitely. And that's why the genre is really important to have that link there. Like if you
Hmm.
read within a genre, and lots of people do, they know just from the title if that book is for them or not. Sometimes, not always.
Um, can you elaborate more on placeholder titles? This is a question from Deb. They're thinking about memoir. How would you think about like placeholder titles in terms of memoir?
I mean, I really feel like the strategy for me at least, determining if something if is a placeholder or not, stays true across all genres. And it's that if you handed the book to any like one person or five of them, like The Hunger Games without any title, and these people read it or you read it, you'd come up with the same title that the author did or something very similar, or maybe their second choice title. But if you had to write down three names, one of those names would be the same one that was actually on the book or that the author wanted to place on the book. So that would be true too for memoir. And a lot of memoir, I'm trying to think of like a lot of the memoir I really like pretty clearly like communicates themes in the stories. Like I was thinking of oh, I'm gonna mispronounce her last name, but Ruth Reichel, how she wrote Tender at the Bone, and also Garlic and Sapphire. And Garlic and Sapphire is about her time as a New York Times like restaurant critic, and how she would go undercover in disguise to like give feedback on these
Mhm.
restaurants as a critic. And so Garlic and Sapphires is really good at like communicating two of the themes of the book, and so is Tender at the Bone. And I feel like most memoirs, the titles generally go more towards tone or theme, um, but they're often, I guess, a little more like poetry in that they often are a little more open to interpretation and don't necessarily tend to be the placeholder title as much.
Uh, I think of one of the most memorable memoir titles for me that always jumps into my head is Living with a Seal, which is a book about living with a Navy SEAL and training with that person. A very engaging book also.
But that's an example of a
Yeah.
placeholder title that works.
And often placeholder titles are the right title, right?
Yeah, and that book is a lot more like sort of mainstream commercial than the ones I mentioned. I mean, the one I mentioned
Hmm.
is also a New York Times bestseller, but it definitely leans more literary. So that's important too. Like there's more than one kind of memoir. There's like a whole genre of poets writing memoir, actually.
We have a question with Carmen from Carmen. With editors, is there a preference for a long title versus a short title for a poem?
I have interviewed a lot of poetry editors over the years. I run a course with Ella Perry on where every October and April we write a bunch of poems together, and like as a large class, usually 30 and 30 or 31 and 31. So one poem per day, but you don't have to do that. And part of that class is we bring in poetry editors, which is wonderful. And I'm really excited. We're going to have the editor of Sixth Finch in for this one. Um, this October session. And so none of them have mentioned any preferences in terms of length for poetry titles, but a lot of them have mentioned that they want more distinct poetry titles. That has come up a couple of times, but never length. And
Yeah,
I do think that the length matters a little with the poem, but as long as it's not, the size of the poem, unless the poem's really short, you're usually good.
most poetry editors, as part of their job, read so many poems in order to select the few they publish. And so many poems that are submitted have very generic titles. So it also, I imagine it all sort of muddles in their head.
Definitely.
You want to find a way to be memorable when they're going back and deciding which poem to choose. Lena asked, Emily mentioned she uses prompts in a class. Can we have details on upcoming classes and how to sign up? If you like this talk, and this is just a very brief aside, and feel no pressure to sign up or even listen to the next minute, but we're running the Writers' Room for Poets, which is a month of poetry prompts and live meetings and interviews with guest editors. That is for the month of October. We'll have details about that soon, and you'll get to spend, if you join, a lot of time with Emily Harstone, and writing prompts and live events and whatnot. So for those who are interested, there will be an opportunity soon. Um, this is a good question, I think, from MD. What if your title is perfect for the book and its tone, but half the people love it and the other half hate it?
I would say that that's a really interesting question, and I'm so glad you asked it because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually. And it's something I've talked about in other talks in relation to other things, but it really depends on who is your intended audience. Do the people like that love it, are they your intended audience? And do the people that hate it, are they not your intended audience? Because that is like a huge piece of the puzzle. Like my mom bought The Hunger Games at an airport because it was on the bestseller list. And she really loved the first 20, 30, whatever pages until the minute the first like character uh like killed someone else, and then she took the book and threw it in a garbage can. And not that she hated the book and not that she'd stop anyone else from reading it, but she was not the intended audience. And she'd found herself way too deep in a book that she did not want to read in any way, actually. Um, and it's not like the book hadn't prepared her for that. She just got so sucked into the world that this happened. So what I'm saying with that is that that it's really good if you're eliminating readers that wouldn't want to read your work anyways. And like You Sexy Thing, that science fiction book I mentioned earlier, it has sort of like a divisive reaction. Like some people I've recommended it to, like former students, that like wrote similar books were like, I don't want to read anything called that. And I'm like, just go with it. You have to give it a try. And they ended up loving it, but the title wasn't for them. So sometimes your title can alienate your audience a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, putting on my marketing hat, I think I agree with everything you say, where you do want to think about who you want to reach. And ultimately, what you want is people who love your writing and the title as part of that. So if there's people who love it and they're the people you want to reach, that's good. If there's people who hate your title, you have to decide whether or not that matters. Because if you're still reaching the people that you want to reach and they like what you're doing, then there's always going to be people who don't like what you're doing if you reach enough people. So focus on the ones that you want to benefit and reach for, and they're the ones who have an opinion that matters, right?
Your audience shouldn't be everyone because everyone has different taste.
Um, what do you think about using a line from someone else's poetry as your title? Is that something you can do?
Definitely, there's a long tradition of this. I really like doing this. I do this as prompts sometimes. I do this myself. I have a poem titled If Every Man is a Tower of Birds, which is a line from Ilya Kaminsky, and he uses it in this other poem, which isn't about that at all. And I kept being like, but I want to know more about like every man being a tower of birds. What kind? What am I supposed to picture here? What does that make women? Like all sorts of questions arose from this like line that
Mhm.
I didn't explore. So I wrote a whole poem following that line. And that is the title. And then afterwards, you say after Ilya Kaminsky, like you give credit to the original author. And then at the end, you can also include like the title, like you can say after Ilya Kaminsky's poem. I can't remember what his poem was titled right now, but you include that.
Hmm.
And this is a very common and understood strategy, and you see it a lot in literary journals. And because you're giving credit to the original writer, there's nothing wrong with it. And a lot of the times they really enjoy this. So
We have a question from Michael Rosenstein. For short stories, I suspect signaling the genre is less critical, since the story, if it's published, will likely be in an online form or magazine for which the genre is already clear, making it more critical to communicate themes and or something unique. Would you agree?
I definitely would agree. And that's an excellent point. Yes.
I know short stories often end up in collections, and how did collections for short stories get titled? Do you have thoughts on that? Is that something you know very much about?
Um, so just based on my observation, that is almost always about the central theme of like
Hmm.
the story, whatever brings them together, whatever like the short stories could be a little disparate, but there's usually something that's tying them together, even if it's just tone. And that's usually what ends up being the title of the collection.
We have a question from someone whose name shows up just as a heart. Oh, that's nice. If you are writing a series that could also be treated as individual books on their own, do you need to have the book titled as book one and book two, even though the titles can be individually unique?
I hope I'm understanding this question.
I think they're talking about books all that are linked, but not necessarily that also stand alone.
I mean, that's something usually the publisher would have a really strong opinion about. Are
Yeah.
they going to like market it as a series, or are they going to market it as standalone books, or is it going to be somewhat in between? I remember reading Transit from Rachel Cusk's trilogy, and all of them worked independently, but they still really like encouraged this idea that it was a trilogy of books. Um, I would say usually you would have the series titles somewhere, but you wouldn't just call them like book one or book two. They would all have their own unique title also.
Uh, Lena has a question. Wait, not Lena. Sorry, Zoom jumped around. Um, Lisa has a title. How long is too long for a title? Maybe talk about novels and then a poem.
I think there's exceptions to every rule, so I'm really bad at being like hard and fast rules, but I would say most titles of books are under 7 words and most should be under 5, I think. That's my opinion. I'm very bad with numbers. I
Hmm.
once told someone my laptop cost $20,000, which it definitely did not, but I was freaking out about it. It was very expensive for me at the time. And then I think for poems, they really can be longer. I've had titles that are whole sentences, and they've never been an issue placing those actually. So I don't really see an issue there. And like one of the strategies for like titling your poem is, for the first line to be the title. And so that can be like a longer line sometimes.
Uh, this question made me think of a really popular book series by Becky Chambers, The Wayfarers, and some of these titles are really great, like The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. That is a longer title that's also really evocative. Um,
Yeah, and that's about 7 words.
yeah, and it's still within the limit you were talking about, but that's on the longer side. A Psalm for the Wild Built's another one. I really recommend that book.
I would
Um,
too.
oh, Matthew S. says, can you explain the purpose of a book title ending with a novel?
So that usually wouldn't be considered the title. That would be considered the subtitle or the genre. And that can often be because I've noticed it more when it's a title that could apply to like nonfiction, or it's by an author who like has written a lot of poetry or in another genre, just so they know distinctly it's a novel. But it's usually never considered part of the actual title. Like if you were looking it up on Goodreads, you wouldn't have to say like The Wanderers, a novel. You just have to say The Wanderers, and then it would show up, even if a novel was on the title. It's usually not considered part of the title. It's just on the main page.
This makes me think of all of the things that go into designing a cover of a book. All of the information on the cover, especially from like the major, more commercial publishers, is designed to attract the right readers. And sometimes they can have equal or more weight than the title. For example, sometimes you'll notice with particularly famous authors that the author's name is far larger and more prominent than the title, and the title hardly matters because people who are fans of that author just want to buy that author's books. Uh,
So there is one question I'd like to answer in
yeah,
the Q&A, and
go
it's
ahead.
Lucia, I think, Lucia. I'm strong with titles too, but I pick your brain on untitled poems. I only have a couple untitled, and none with no actual titles, but I'd like your opinion, please. And so my opinion with untitled poems, especially, so I have started writing a whole series of poems that have very similar titles, but I discovered pretty quickly that if they had identical titles, it was really hard to keep track of them and to promote them when I was publishing them and to share them with friends. And I mean, I know that's a strategy with books, but if you're getting them published individually, it's still really tricky. And so I worry if you have more than one untitled poem, it falls into that trap. And the other thing is that even with an untitled poem, like a poem that says untitled, you're giving up this space that you could use and utilize. And so I lean against it. I can't think of a single untitled poem, even though I've read many, that has really stuck with me or is memorable, or I'd be like, oh, that's written by this author. You should read it. So I am gently, personally on the line of not being a fan of untitled poems, technically. But I'm open to having my mind changed.
We have a question from Don. What can you say about using a bilingual title, or especially commonly known foreign words?
I think a commonly known foreign word would be totally fine if it fit the theme and idea of your work, obviously. And I think it's harder if you're having both languages in the title, because that's a gap, and that makes it seem more like nonfiction or more serious. And like I've read a lot of books now that use like words that are not English in the text without describing, like without providing a translation. And this is common in poetry also. And I have no issue with that because you're spending time with the work and it usually makes sense within context and you can always like look it up. Um, but for a title, you want it to be memorable and stick in the reader's mind and then to connect with something. And so if it's like a really unusual foreign word, that's a little harder for that to happen. I'm not saying it can't work. I'm just saying that it's definitely like more of a challenge for oneself.
Mhm. We have a question from Caroline. My poetry collection is about living in another country, namely the Fiji Islands. Should that be included in the title, or would it work to include the Fiji poems as a subtitle?
I have seen like subtitles for poetry collections for sure. I would probably leave that for the subtitle unless it's like a very like if you only want a limited audience or you really like are marketing it at like tourists to this region or something like that, I would go with a different title for the whole collection, but definitely keep that subtitle in play at least.
Mhm. Especially if you want to reach people who are particularly interested in Fiji. We have time for just one more question. Oh, from Peggy, is there any trick to titles for children's stories or books?
I think, and this is really interesting. I think you really have to make it so that it's appeals to both children and parents because like the parent or adults in general are usually buying or selecting it. But like even if I show my child like certain books, the title and the cover, this is a big role in children's books, especially they won't be interested in it as much if the cover is really dour or boring or not well illustrated. Um, so that's definitely like something to keep in mind. But like there's all these trends within Kidslit, and a lot of the books can sort of like be categorized by that. Like I saw one of my children is really into like animal books, like books from the perspective of animals. So I saw a new book called Little Shrew, which is very good. And I knew right from that title and the illustration that it was for my daughter, even though it was just this placeholder title. I'm trying to read, I'm surrounded by kids' books, so I'm trying to be reminded of certain titles there. And I actually spotted Little Shrew, and there's like City of Secrets that like sets the premise really well. Um, yeah, so all those sort of things is make it appealing and accessible, not a super complicated word, but also not, maybe don't name it just poop or something like that. That might turn a lot of adults off, but not everyone poops because that's a bestseller. So
But that also serves parents in a very specific way.
definitely know when you need that book or when you don't.
Mhm. We are, on that note, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, for being here today and for your time and care and attention. We have a wonderful audience of writers at Authors Publish, and I'm very grateful for all of you. Thank you to everybody at Authors Publish who makes these talks possible. Caitlin Jans, our editor in particular, thank you. And thank you to S. Calikar and Ella Perry and everybody who also contributes. And thank you to all of our Authors Published supporters who've supported the lecture series over the years. Thank you very much. I feel really grateful to be hosting them and to be able to present so many wonderful talks to you. I have learned so much. And I did mention that Emily will be hosting a class. If you want to be part of that, we'll be sending out an announcement soon. Emily, is there anything else you would like to say?
Just if you send an email to support@authorspublish.com, I see that too. So if you have any questions that you want me to answer via email, I'm happy to do that also. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, very much. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.